Welcome, everyone, to the book launch event of Global Pandemics and Epistemic Crises in Psychology, a socio-philosophical approach. A book that is published today by Routledge in Brent Slife's book series on the advancements in theoretical and philosophical psychology. You can find the table of contents just below the stream on YouTube, together with a link to the publisher's website, where you can also buy the book if you like. We're lucky to be joined by most of the authors in this collected volume today. They will introduce their individual contributions in a moment, after which we will have a short discussion. This volume is, as you might guess from the title, about crises. And even though it's motivated by a conference almost a year ago, and by the very recent and still ongoing global COVID-19 crisis, the book goes beyond that particular event and looks at crises in relation to psychology as a discipline. The volume is organized in 3 parts, and this is how we will go about the contributions as well. Part 1 reflects upon psychology in crisis. Part 2 looks at crisis and relationality in psychology, and part 3 focuses on the political aspects of a discipline in crisis. Let's go into it and talk about part 1 of the book.
Hello, and welcome also from my side. So if we look at the history of psychology, we can find actually perpetual crises. Crises that inquire about the nature of the discipline and its subject matter. And actually the list of prominent authors who discuss psychology in crisis is pretty long and reaches back also to the alleged origins of the discipline in Leipzig, Germany. The most recent hit to the integrity of psychology as a science is maybe the replication crisis, actually, which again showed that psychologists probably really need to rethink their discipline, including their methods, their history, their data, and the basic assumptions and what these rest on. So the authors of part 1 in this volume discuss these questions, and thus we'd like them to briefly introduce their individual contributions. And may I ask Jeffrey Reber, would you make a start?
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Jeff Reber, and I'm a professor at the University of West Georgia. My specialization is psychology, social psychology, relational psychology, is where I spend most of my time working. My chapter title is Lessons Learned the Hard Way, Crisis and the Rethinking of Psychological Assumptions about Altruism and Agency. My chapter focuses on ways in which crises, and particularly global crises, magnify important aspects of human being that might otherwise go unnoticed or receive little attention by psychologists. It also considers ways in which crises illuminate potential inadequacies within the discipline in accounting for these important psychological features and phenomena. Using the examples of altruism and agency, both of which were magnified by the global crisis of World War II and the Holocaust, this chapter examines how some psychologists have felt compelled to rethink the common assumptions of egoism and determinism in the discipline. This chapter asserts that in light of the current COVID-19 pandemic, this rethinking must continue and must be taken ever more seriously by psychologists if they hope to practice a discipline that is adequate to its rich, complex, and often surprising subject matter, which is nothing less than human being. Thank you so much.
Ines, you're next.
All right. Is it working? Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Okay, my name is Ines Langemeyer. I'm a professor at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology on the research of teaching and learning. And my chapter is on learning in the face of a crisis. And talking about a crisis for me means to talk absolutely of the pandemic, but also of the climate change and the extinction of species. So it's the planetarian character of these problems that I address. And looking at this planetary character means that also learning means something different from what we actually experience in schools and in universities. So learning cannot be just something that is taking place on an individual plane. It must be a learning process of a higher order, or something that goes beyond picking up pieces of knowledge. Learning here must be a process of a multidisciplinary and societal engagement, and also something that changes societal conditions. If we have reasoning and experiencing immersed in these changes, then also these experiences and the reasoning feeds back into our social engagements. What we have to overcome is then also the divide, that we first need to know something completely before we act upon solutions. We have to be immersed in solutions that are in the progress, that are in the making. And also these understandings of learning, they are connected to emotions and motivations. We have to understand how emotions are also challenging to the individual, because they are connected to the problem of being afraid, of causing new problems, of doing something wrong. If we change the notion of learning very radically, then we come to a very different way of learning. This is what the chapter is about, and I just want people to be interested in reading the chapter. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Flor von Aula, researcher in cultural psychology at the Autónoma University in Madrid, Spain. And with Ignacio Brescó de Luna, we wrote the chapter called The Imaginative Co-Construction of Past and Future in Times of Crisis. And I will also be talking on behalf of Ignacio today. So first of all, we would like to thank the editors and organizers of last year's conference, which brought forth this collective volume, for their initiative and efforts. And with our chapter, we have tried to put the imagination of the future in historical perspective and examine how horizons of expectations and spaces of experience have dynamically co-constructed each other before, during, and after modernity, even constituting different notions of time. We have done this not only to situate and understand the imagination of futures in times of crises, when, as we now know, the immersion in the present is deep, the progressive connection between past, present, and future is broken, and somehow the goal-directedness of our action is suspended, but our chapter also echoes a call for radical new ways of imagining. We think that the pandemic and similar crises, still to come, point at the urgent need for our imagination to move beyond a backward or idealized past, a utopian or dystopian future, and a present standing on its own. So whether it's with new narratives or radical hope, a circular or ecosystemic notion of time, we agree, in the words of Isabel Stengers, that we need to recultivate the deserts of our imagination. Thank you.
Also in this part of our edited volume, you will find Roger Free's contribution, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. In his chapter entitled Living with Vulnerability, Roger relies on historical analysis. He shows how past pandemics had devastating effects on indigenous peoples. And he points to processes of marginalization and destruction during crisis, but also to dealing with social trauma as responses to collective crisis. Roger shows how histories of epidemics are also always histories of inequalities, and points out that it is not the pandemics, but societies that discriminate. The chapter concludes on a note of hope. Faced with vulnerability, understanding resilience, and practicing solidarity might allow us to imagine better futures focused on humanity and environmental responsibility rather than violence and exploitation.
Which brings us to part 2 of this edited volume with the title Crisis and Relationality. Part 2 moves from looking at psychology in a state of crisis to the treatment of crises in psychology. From a traditional psychology point of view, crises are there so individuals can overcome them. Better yet, maybe avoid them in the first place. That human beings change over time and over the course of their lives is at least supposedly well understood in mainstream psychology. However, this change is still tentatively explained with fixed concepts and notions of having something or reaching a certain goal, overcoming tensions, ambiguity, and uncertainty. A more relational understanding of crisis that is offered in part 2 of this book sees tensions and moments of crisis not necessarily as signifiers of critical situations, of extraordinary events, but as co-constructed constituents of our lives. So I would like to ask the contributors of part 2 to introduce their chapters.
Hi there. My name is Michael Bamberg, and I'm the author of the chapter entitled Uncertainty. Have we ever been certain? So this is a rhetorical question, but it gives us the opportunity to reflect on what crisis and uncertainty talk, or narratives, I call them here, consist of and what they are good for or not. So what I've done in my chapter is that the US advertising industry rushed into just to borrow and make central to their branding strategies and to their strategies to sell their products. So the clips that I analyze on YouTube, and I go deeper into them in my chapter, they document or try to document how the pharma industry, evangelists, Madonna in the bathtub, and Trump have utilized the crisis narrative, that is how science, religion, celebritism, and politics are joining up in making use of crisis talk for profit purposes. And then I go one step further in the chapter and try to show in a lot more detail how psychology is riding in the midst of them the same horse. So why bother? So what? Because others have made similar points in the past. Well, for once, I want to maintain that I can show and document in detail by making use of a qualitative methodology, and here in particular of positioning analysis, how these dominant narratives develop their hegemonic powers. And that is important to distinguish between them and show how they relate. Yeah? Dominant narratives and hegemonic narratives. Further, this has the potential to open up the territory for psychology to develop and line up with counter narratives, that is, strategies not only to counter dominant narratives, but also to subvert and hopefully ultimately replace their hegemonic battle. And I would say that, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's very interesting. My name is Brent Slife. Before introducing my chapter with Zachary Beckstead, I'd like to say how pleased I am with the inclusion of Martin and Irene's book in my book series with Routledge. And the book series, as Michael had mentioned, or Martin had mentioned, is entitled Advances in Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology. The title of my chapter with Zachary is Healing in Times of Crisis, Instrumental versus Meaningful Relationships. There seems to be little dispute among social scientists that relationships heal, especially in times of crisis. The question raised in our chapter is, what type of relationship? Although instrumental relationships may serve as a kind of band-aid for immediate relief, we question whether these relationships are lasting and healing. We offer instead a framework for what could be called meaningful relationships, rather than treating interpersonal relationship as a means to individual benefit, such as even individual well-being. Meaningful relationships make the connection between partners the end. This seemingly simple move is deceptively difficult to accomplish in Western professional culture. The liberal individualism of the West is an amazingly formidable cultural headwind in attempting to help crisis victims form meaningful relationships. Caregivers should not underestimate how entrenched it is. Indeed, we advise they start their own conceptualizing from philosophical scratch with newly configured assumptions of atomism and holism. One of the more important benefits of this new theoretical beginning is a reconceptualization of systems that reveals how many system approaches are warmed over atomisms in disguise. This new conceptual starting point also leads to radically different practical implications for treating victims of crises, which we go into. For instance, the conventional therapeutic goal of individual happiness is at best only secondarily important in a relational approach to crisis intervention. The common notion of social support is also shown to be instrumental. A relational reorientation also challenges the Enlightenment legacy of prioritizing the light and shunning the darkness of crises. Caregivers should instead help clients embrace the lessons of darkness, where pain, suffering, and their personal shadows are not considered apart from, but a part of their daily lives and interpersonal relationships. Thank you.
Marie-Cècile Bertau, Meghan Klein Toups, Antonia Larrain, and Alexandra Energici engage in a very creative way in their chapter in a written dialogue with each other. Marie-Cècile starts with Giorgio Agamben's notions on the state of exception and provides the basis for discussing language as essential for humans and how they are mediated to their reality. In answer to Bertau, Meghan then discusses language as individual and collective voices and as means of emancipatory therapeutic work that targets a socio-cultural understanding of the self. And then Antonia elaborates the relationships of language and the body further and asks what the body actually can be if we assume discourse as a process in which different positions relate to one another through different languages. And finally, the chapter closes with Alexandra looking at corporality in our daily lives as these lives were transformed by new specifics of time and space during the pandemics, when complex interactions of bodies and language are reduced to online versions of interacting subjects.
Also in this part of the book, you can find Paul Stanner's contribution, who unfortunately cannot be with us today here. Like the other authors in this part of the book, Paul goes beyond the crisis concept as it is regularly understood in psychology. Instead, he relies on liminality. He sees the COVID-19 crisis as a liminal hotspot, a moment of being stuck in transition. In relying on both process philosophy and process anthropology, Paul shows how crises experiences can be understood as liminal transitions. He attempts to rethink the COVID-19 crisis as relational. In this view, the virus produces a liminal disruption in the host that is experienced as an illness. Paul focuses on the UK experience and discusses Brexit politics in addition to COVID-19. Ultimately, he argues that we can only move ahead if psychology as a discipline rethinks the Western ideas and concepts it rests on and relies more on ideas of liminality within a relational framework.
Part 3 of this volume, entitled Theorizing the Political, examine how psychological theories are entangled with political interests, how forms of psychologization serve particular groups, and how, conversely, psychology can unfold emancipatory power. Psychology has, since its inception as a discipline, always been on the margins and in between opposing interests. The contributions in part 3 of this book emphasize the politics of psychology and examine how crises position us in the political field and how psychology is used to exercise control on the one hand, and how psychology can help to rethink matters of oppression and emancipation on the other.
Hi, everyone. This is Clint Burnham from Simon Fraser University, the Lacan Salon in Vancouver. I want to begin by thanking Martin Dege and Irene Strasser for all the work they and their team did in organizing the conference that this book grew out of, and indeed in getting a book out in less than 15 months during lockdown, pandemic, on such an important subject. Pandemics are here to stay. Indeed, ours is not yet over, and this book will continue to be referenced far into the future, I am certain. I also want to note that my talk today comes to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsawwassen, Squamish, and Musqueam First Nations on Canada's west coast. My chapter is called The Coronavirus's Two Bodies and draws on medieval historian Ernst Kantorowicz's political theology to argue that the social situation of COVID-19, which saw an expansion of our online digital presence as teachers, therapists, and workers, introduced a split between our virtual and physical bodies, one that can, in turn, help us better understand Lacanian theories of the subject. So I summarized Kantorowicz's 1957 book, The King's Two Bodies, because of its influence on political theory, Foucault, Agamben, Zizek, and for the crucial thesis he develops that European political theory wrestled for centuries with a distinction between the king's physical body and that which metaphorically stood in for his sovereignty. Critics have since drawn on this way of thinking in, among other ways, to understand representations of the French Revolution, David's 1793 painting, The Death of Marat. And crucial here is the formal dimension, a split screen, David's painting has a black upper half that can be connected to the split subject of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Here we get the bang for our theoretical buck. Kantorowicz's two bodies is a version of the Freudian or Lacanian split subject, the notion that we have unconscious desires and anxieties, that we are castrated by language. And nowhere is this better argued than in Lacan's critique in 1960 of ego psychology in his essay, The Subversion of the Subject and the Dialectic of Desire in the Freudian Unconscious, where he inveighs particularly against the unity of the subject, the notion of a healthy ego, as examples of the imaginary, as fantasies. The two bodies of the coronavirus then means our subjectivity is screened for us on the Zoom grid or our social media page. The split subject has gone viral. We can see the split as well in the class distinctions and inequities exacerbated by the pandemic, whether it is the unhoused, who in my city, and not only here, must endure the double epidemic of COVID and opiate overdoses, or my students who have various levels of access to data plans, technology, and privacy, all suddenly required for university studies. And so I conclude my chapter with the discussion of the implication of the coronavirus's two bodies, or the internet's two bodies, for the university. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I am Luca Tateo. I am professor of theory, epistemology, and methodology of qualitative research at the University of Oslo in Norway. And first of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Martin, Irene, and all the colleagues who contributed to this amazing endeavor, to this very interesting book. In my chapter titled Atmosphere and Semiotic Devices, How to Turn the Right to Healthcare into a War, I try to essentially make 2 points. The first point is to use the concept of atmosphere. It means the creation of a generic atmosphere of fear that is socially functional in some specific moment of crisis. I've always been, for a long time, been working on imaginative and aesthetic dimension of human experience and try to figure out how aesthetics can be a powerful tool of social control and social guidance, especially when it comes to the orientation of the future. So hope and fear are two future-oriented emotions, and who can produce semiotic devices to control socially hope and fear can gain a great power on social processes. The second point I would like I try to make is about the conception of the relationship between the individual meaning making and culture, as it's being questioned in this time of crisis. I think that the most part of psychology has been focusing on the individual trauma-oriented understanding of the global events, such as the pandemic. While instead, I suggest that we should turn to the process of meaning making, which is culturally mediated. And here I propose an idea of culture as a local solutions that human collectives have found to universal existential problems. So we can neither compare the local cultural historically situated solutions, neither we can compare the universality of the psychological experience. What we can understand is that what makes us, what can be generalized is the kind of existential problem that we as human beings have to face. So the idea can be expressed with a metaphor. As human beings, the pandemic crisis and the global events that are most likely to occur in the near future show us that we are not on the same boat as human beings, but we are rather on the same ocean. And depending on the distribution of resources worldwide, sometimes really unfair distribution, we are sailing this ocean together, this global ecosystem, on very different kind of boats. And the idea is that psychology should turn to understand these global dynamics in relation to the individual meaning making. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody out there in the real world from Thessaloniki, northern Greece. My chapter has a title, Security as Pacification, the trap that underlies our psychologizing of social phenomena. My intention is to address the pandemic within psychology called psychologization of social phenomena. Psychologization contributes to the pacification of the population. Italian psychiatrist Franco Basaglia spoke about the crimes of pacification as a fundamental aspect of psychology's social function, as its disciplinary contribution to securing the insecurity of capitalist order. I'm unfolding my argument starting with a dialectics between the factuality of crisis and crisis talk. In times of so-called crisis, what we see is to a significant extent staged. It is produced by powerful elites and labeled by authoritative social scientists. It attains its factuality from power-related representation, projecting only one seemingly reasonable, legitimate naming and only one unavoidable solution. As psychologists, we are receiving salary and prestige for conceiving and suggesting names and solutions. We contribute with our expert knowledge to any crisis talk, bringing about compliance in the populace. Those who order and purchase such expertise are usually bureaucracies and other elites. The call for compliance is a call for evidence-based legitimation of administrative bureaucratic action. The timeless tool of our discipline for production of compliance is the psychologization of social phenomena. Psychologization is not some cognitive shortcoming or failure, but rather a particular way of channeling the understanding of human action. Three levers, three consecutive reductions build complementarily upon each other and put psychologization at work. A reductio ad individuum, the prevailing functionalism of human action, and the banishment of the political character of every human action. Psychologization and pacification as its social consequence are not some scientific shortcomings or failures of individual psychologists. On the contrary, they designate normality and professional success of the discipline psychology within antagonistic societies. Psychologization and pacification are the operational foundation for our business, the premise for social recognition and access to resources and prestige for psychology. Thank you.
Thank you, Athanasios, and thank you so much to everyone for your introductions today, and of course, your contributions to this very timely volume, as I believe. I'm very happy that we have such a great variety of different perspectives represented, different perspectives on psychology and on crises. So we've heard about how we use language, about healing and relationality, the history of psychology, and also the history of crisis in psychology, future psychologies, uncertainty, lessons learned. And that all brings me to the question, if I may, what do you all think would be the most pressing changes for the discipline in order to deal with the transformed social and political arena? Or put differently, how to rethink theorizing in psychology?
Well, I guess I could start, Irene. I was taken a bit with Jeff Reber's argument about one aspect of the crisis within our discipline of psychology and the crisis, and that is the determinism of many, many theories within psychology. And I guess I was thinking, perhaps he would agree, I'm not sure, but when crises occur, we are rightly drawn to victimhood. But given that most of our theories tend to emphasize that we're all determined in some form or fashion, which leads, it seems to me, ultimately to a victimhood almost all the time, I'm wondering how our discipline moves toward the enhancement and facilitation of human agency, of possibility, of opportunity.
I'm happy to respond a little bit to that. I think if we look at the history lesson of the Holocaust, perhaps we find that there's a tendency towards a two sort of step process. And the first step following the Holocaust, at least in social psychology, was to look at victims, to try to understand perpetrators, and to understand the deterministic dynamics that led to that perpetration. But the second step, which I think is the one more interesting and the one more relevant to my chapter, is the step of those who intervened to stop the perpetration against the victims, like rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust. They become quite mysterious in a deterministic, egoistic worldview. And so in that second step, which has come later, we're first sort of traumatized by the evil that we see, and then comes this sort of shock of light by the altruism we see. And in that second step, we start to become aware that determinism might fall short in its ability to account for those who intervene, that it might be undesirable, even if it doesn't fall short, to use a deterministic account, because it robs their experience, their activities of their meaning. And it makes our psychology potentially inadequate to that full meaning of their actions. So I hope that with the current pandemic as well, we'll see both of those steps. I imagine people got upset by the ways people were being selfish and acting in ways that were insensitive to others, but I think we also have evidence of people who have done heroic and incredible intervention to try to affect positive, outcomes with the way that COVID, affected us. I mentioned nurses in my chapter as an example, my wife being a nurse. And I think there we have a chance to really bolster an argument around agency against determinism. But I think the key to this will be ultimately, Brent, what you have talked about. I think for me, what is needed most pressingly is an urgent change from an individualism worldview, and specifically an individualistic morality, to a relational worldview, and specifically a relational ethic that I believe since the time of the Holocaust until now has been shown to be the only viable alternative that would prevent the kind of perpetration, evil, bad behaviors we see when crises come to pass. I think it's the only alternative that's truly viable to get us to move through the crisis in ways that are growthful, and a psychology that is incorporating that understanding, that relational worldview, I think will be adequate to the full range of behaviors that we see with our current pandemic.
I'll just do a quick response, but I love that, especially when you talk about relationality, because I think we need to cultivate a little bit better what a relational agency would be. Too often, agency is framed, at least in the US, I believe, in atomistic, sort of in self-contained fashion. And I think that if we can move more toward a relational account, it will allow us to take into account the context of that's absolutely critical, right, in crises. But its context isn't just a determining set of forces. Context is a set of possibilities. And so if we can frame that differently, I think we can begin to account for the kind of thing you're talking about.
I would like to pick up the point of determinism here. And I think what is very important to understand the overdetermination. It's not just that we have to control determinations as single determinations, as for example, the infection by one virus. It's also that if you have the security and measurements to reduce the infection rate, that you produce new things. You produce new effects for society, and then you cause many, many new problems. So it's by solving one problem, you cause many new problems. And if you talk about agency, I really appreciate this, and also in a relational perspective to see how relations go on. Then also the overdetermination is very important, because you cannot just solve the problem by one solution. There is not one solution. And this is what I try to pick out by looking at learning. You have mostly an understanding that learning is about the right knowledge. But it's not like this. If you look at overdeterminations, there's not this one solution. You have to find solutions in the way you're going, in the way you're resolving certain problems. And then you have to be aware of the many other problems that you cause with it. And this is a new type of learning in my eyes.
I just want to pitch in here, if I may. I mean, I'm interested in these questions of determination and overdetermination, and certainly, so thanks, Ines, for that, because I think, like, certainly with, to turn to the social, with the pandemic, it's been at the same time that we're much, we've had this kind of, at first, a climate break where, deer were wandering around in major cities and so on, or you could see Mount Everest. But then, as this past summer, as the flooding, the fires, the heat dome, and so on and so forth, we've been reminded of the real of climate crisis itself, but also with racialized state violence over the past year and a half with the George Floyd killing and the sort of politics around that. So these are overdetermined in some ways. But if I can, that question of determination, but also agency, that I continue to think about in terms of this idea of the two bodies. When and I think isn't it 3 or 4 members of Boris Johnson's cabinet now who are quarantining or have I shouldn't be laughing, because I mean but nonetheless, they're trying to open up Britain, and yet they're still being subject to the Delta variant. So these leaders think they don't have a physical body. They think that they're somehow they are exempt from this. And that is the same attitude that I think in some ways contributes to vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaxxer practices. And not only in the US, it's easy enough to point to the US, but I mean, certainly in France, certainly in my country, in lesser numbers and so on, where people think they have agency. I can do what I want in that sort of individualistic sort of notion of identity and agency, the atomized notion of agency, as I think Brent and Jeffrey, you were both talking about. But nonetheless, they somehow imagine they don't have bodies, they're not part of the material world. So certainly, I think, for me, what the pandemic and what the responses to the pandemic have illustrated are ways in which to keep thinking about how we constitute ourselves, both in terms of our physical bodies, and then whether it's, you know, this sort of theoretical ideas of the unconscious and so on, or our desires, where agency fits into that, and where it also ends up being social, because many people, of course, don't have the agency. And so whether they're frontline workers or nurses, as I think Jeffrey, you were saying, or you know, people who deliver food, people who are in prisons and in the favelas and so on, who don't have any sort of have a lot. They do have agency, but they have a lot less agency in comparison.
I might just add very briefly, because I've taken time already, but I think what is really fascinating about a relational agency potentially is that there is a kind of relational determinism, but it's not a determinism in that cause-effect, atomistic, physicalistic way. It's a determinism that Levinas and Knud Lugstrup talk about, which is this ethical demand upon us. And I think you're speaking to this, you know, Clint, both bodily and socially. The other places a demand upon me that I don't get to choose and that I must respond to. The rescuers of Jews almost across the board say they had no choice. But they don't really mean that they didn't have a choice in a deterministic sense in the atomistic way. They had no choice because of their ethical sense of obligation to the other. And I think that starts moving us in a different direction that's really quite nice in response to what you're saying, Clint, both the other as environment, the other as larger social institutions and structures, the other as the individual. I think we get an interesting kind of relational determinism out of that.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And just very quickly as well, I don't think we should have a choice for getting vaccinated. I mean, obviously people have health conditions and so on, but this, I don't feel it's my choice. It's not like going to the store and buying a Pepsi or a Coke. No, this is my responsibility and my duty as a member of society.
If I may elaborate on this point of agency, determinism, and relationality. Briefly, I think I've learned two lessons throughout this experience. The first one is that psychology definitely has to overcome itself. So we are still within a framework that is no longer working. And the second one is that collectively, probably we have not learned anything from this pandemic crisis so far. What you are talking about seems to me to stay within a kind of traditional idea of agency and relation, while it seems to me that we are here talking about relational in sense of ecological. Ecological means bringing into the relation the fact that every action we make, no matter on which ethical basis, has consequences. And it's very clear almost in a karmic way. So as consequences horizontally, historically, whatever we do, even with the best of intentions. As Ines was mentioning, just imagine, for instance, disposable face mask. We don't have any idea of the consequences of a massive spread of this object in the environment and the long-term consequences, as well as we have no idea so far. And I agree with Jeff that we are almost in the same situation after the World War II. We don't know what are the consequences for the human collectives of this pandemic. So what are the long-term consequences? We don't know anything about this. And psychology, of course, has no answer so far. probably no social science as an answer so far. Why? Because we are dealing with ecological problems. So it means that really everything is connected to everything. How we can epistemologically develop psychology in this direction, I have no idea yet. But I think that's something we have to learn in the near future.
Yeah, Luca, I mean, you're right. We don't know the consequences completely, but still, we still have to learn something right now because we act right now. So it means that we have to deal with uncertain knowledge. And if we have not a clear picture, we still have an imagination, and we can imagine that there's a detrimental effect on the environment if we produce masks that are not redisposable. So this is definite. I mean, we don't have to have the numbers, the correct numbers of the effects. We have an imagination of what is going wrong. And this could be also a facet of the new way of learning. We have to take things seriously and not just say, just because it's not perfectly scientifically illuminated, this is why we just ignore it. I mean, like the climate change, because it's not proven, we cannot just say we ignore it. We have to take things more serious in these ways to change it. And then there's also the problem that if we think of the knowledge that an individual person has, we always have this atomized form of knowledge. We don't have a socialized form of knowledge. We have to build and learn to build a knowledge that is going beyond the personal and the individual. It's a knowledge like scientific knowledge. That's the character of scientific knowledge. It's a certain experience that goes beyond this frame of personal experience.
Yeah,
and we have to learn to be part of it, to participate, to be a participant, to be someone who contributes to enrich this kind of knowledge. It's a very different form of knowledge.
Definitely, I completely agree. Just let me add that maybe I would say that we have shown lack of imagination in this case. Like, for instance, focusing on the short-term solutions without imagining how also to dispose what we create. We have introduced things like programmed obsolescence, which is, if you think, it's incredible. So first of all, imagination can be disruptive and detrimental also. So in this sense, I think that we don't have to just to praise imagination. We have to be, again, aware of the consequences of our imagination as well as the consequence of our lack of imagination. That was just to complement.
If I may add something, but it's a different discussion. I think one important thing psychology has to go through is to think of, to historize its existence, which means what we know at the moment since 100 years as psychology, whether mainstream or critical, whatever, is related to a particular form of organization of society, which is called Fordism. And also we have the last decades major changes in the form of organizing society, which are not reflected, not critical, and not only, or also not system immanent. I would say even mainstream psychology, it will be questioned if it continues to produce whatever knowledge or solutions for our normality, which is not anymore the only one normality. So neoliberalism demands new kind of normality from people. Even what and taking the example from Jeffrey and from others about relationality, we can and this example with relationality, yeah, there's a dialectic in neoliberalism, which means that relationality is demanded by neoliberalism, but in order to exploit it as part of human sociality. So which means relationality is not a solution. Relationality within neoliberalism is a new normality. It's a new mainstream thing, or whatever, and we can play this through. So the first thing, what I think the first change is psychology, mainstream or critical, has to reflect about its historicity and its historical whatever, yeah, premises. It's not a science and whatever beyond history and time. It's a particular answer, social praxis, we can say, for a particular form of organization of society, which is old, 100 years, and now this change is very radical. And here we are, I think, a lot behind. This is a new question. And my second point I want to mention is that there is an old question which still remains. The old question which was exists since 100 years. Whose perspective will or wants psychology to serve? As I mentioned before, or very shortly, the perspective, the answers we are trying to give, the questions we are trying to give answers are questions from bureaucracies. So if we want to continue this, then okay. But this is a bureaucratic solutions. We have bureaucratic questions, and so we really offer solutions for bureaucracies or for elites. For my students, I use the example that I studied in Germany, and I have a diploma psychology, and the studies in psychology were formalized in Germany by the Nazi Wehrmacht. So the very idea of what a psychologist is and what how he or she has to study was formalized in 1943 by the German Wehrmacht. So what is the interest of the Nazi Wehrmacht to formalize a study called psychology? So I don't want to mention the Nazis here as something very bad, but we have to think about our involvement, entanglement in concrete societal organization, and this is we do not enough, and we do not sometimes not at all. So far.
Sorry. There are people that didn't talk, so I don't want to clear this stage. Just want to touch the last point of Tanasi. I think another lesson learned from this pandemic is that we have to multiply the centers of knowledge of psychology. So there is a lot going on everywhere in the world, a lot of fundamental knowledge created everywhere. So we have to really take a global perspective in this sense.
But Luca, there's also a lot of BS that is created within our discipline. What I was trying to say is, right, there's a lot of knowledge that is being created in centers around the world under the header of psychology. But I wanted to counter a little bit or caution, because there's a lot of stuff that is hegemonic, that is problematic, that we have to worry about. And this in my own, this in places that we are familiar with.
I completely agree. I completely agree.
In which case, how do we discern the quality, right? Well, how do we discern what's good and what's not? And I guess I would recur to Jeff's notion of a relational ethic, Okay, yeah, good. So that's something it'd be fun to talk about more.
Well, I guess the next edited volume then has to be concerned with relational ethics and maybe even more so relational agency as we have discussed it now. I think many of the things that you have mentioned are happening right now, and that's why I personally find this particular moment in time for psychology interesting, where suddenly we start to talk about decolonizing psychology, where we talk about different perspectives, where it seems that with the replication crisis, but also with other things that become evident now, Western psychology becomes historicized, as Athanasios was demanding, and this is not necessarily the way for every psychology to be historicized, but I think for Western psychology to realize its place on this planet, its place within different interpretations of psychology, historicization is maybe very helpful in order to understand how we rely on a particular Western philosophy. Many interesting points have been mentioned, and there is lots to go about, I think, but that is really what we need to do in future articles to be written. I'd like to thank you all for spending the time with us. We wanted to go for an hour, and we managed just that. Everyone out there, the articles are absolute fun to read. I have read them all, so I know. So the link for the publisher's website is at the very bottom below this stream. And in a few seconds, some secret hand will also add a code that will give you a few % off if you order the book. So thank you all for listening. I hope to see you all soon at some place, maybe online, maybe in the real world. Bye.
Thank you so much, Irene and Martin. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.